I had a short conversation with my brother the other day that went something like this. Hey, have you heard of the new monster Amudron? No, what does he do? He's like a reverse Mizutsune. He's a leviathan that attacks you with mud. That's cool, but doesn't Mizutsune use oil? So isn't Mizutsune also getting you all dirty? To which I replied, yeah, that's how bubbles work. Which is not actually true. I know how they really worked, and as I was thinking about it, my train of thought drove straight down a rabbit hole, and now I'm here making this video, all to answer one question. How does Mizutsune make its bubbles? For those unfamiliar with the world of the Monster Hunter games, it is populated by a large amount of draconic beasts. Each monster in Monster Hunter has a special ability. Mizutsune's skin secretes a mysterious liquid known, for obvious reasons, as bubble foam. This liquid is extremely slippery, and the Mizutsune coats itself with this liquid in order to slide around and travel quickly. Its tail is covered in hair-like bristles which it uses to stir up the bubble foam and make bubbles to attack with. So what is bubble foam? Simply put, it would be soap. Although my brother wasn't far off in assuming it was oil. The chemical structures are very similar, but soap has an important property that makes it great at cleaning and also making bubbles. To start off, this is water. Water is the most common liquid on Earth's surface, and it's essential for life. The chemical structure is just two hydrogen atoms, represented by these white balls, bonded to the oxygen, represented by a red ball. This is a covalent bond, meaning they are stuck together because they are sharing electrons. However, oxygen has an important property in that it is very greedy. While electrons in these bonds are being shared, oxygen spends much more time with them than either hydrogen does. This sort of turns the water molecules into a tiny magnet. The oxygen has a slight negative charge, and the hydrogens have slight positive charges. So when your water molecules are moving around, they're attracted to each other, and they like to line up. They don't stay like that for very long since they're always moving and bumping around, but they do their best. Now this is an oil molecule. As you can see, it's got a lot of hydrogens, but it's also got a lot of these black spheres, which represent carbon. Carbon is not greedy like oxygen is, so the electrons are shared evenly throughout the whole molecule. Now, when you put an oil molecule in among water molecules, it makes the water very unhappy. Remember that water wants to line up like a little magnet, and if we put something in the way, the water molecules move around it to get together again. As this happens, our molecule is shoved out of the water. This is why oil and water don't mix. The oil gets in the water's way, so the water kicks it out. Now, this is a major problem because we wash almost everything with water, and there are other things like oil that don't have magnetic poles, so it's harder to wash off. So what do? We use soap. This is a soap molecule. Now, there are some more complex stuff going on that I can't represent with this model, but it's got all of the important parts. As you can see, it's got this long carbon chain, like an oil, but it also has these two oxygen atoms here. These oxygens are still really greedy, so they are stealing electrons from those nearby carbons, but the far away carbons aren't affected. So this end has a large polar charge, but the other end doesn't. Because of this, it can hang out with both groups. This end is really polar, so it can hang out with the water, and this end can mix with the non-polar molecules like oil. So if we mix some soap in, the oil and water mix together. This is because the soap forms a cage around the oil, so the outside is polar and the inside is non-polar. Now, what happens with bubbles is a little more complicated. Water has a high surface tension, which means that water molecules like to be close by each other. So when you try to blow a bubble in plain water, the molecules get stretched out, and they don't like that, so they snap back into place and the bubble pops. When we add soap, the non-polar ends are repelled and congregate at the surface, similar to oil. But since they have the polar ends, they are still technically mixed in and don't form a new layer. So when we blow a bubble, the soap molecules will move into this new gap. As the water stretches out, it gets sandwiched between these two layers of soap. Soap's polar attraction interfaces with the water, but it's not as strong as the bonds between two water molecules, so the bond is okay with stretching more, which means that when the bubble is filled with air, then the water can stretch out more. And it's not necessarily impossible for Mizutsune to be able to naturally make soap. I couldn't find any references to real-life animals making soap, but that's mostly because there would be no reason for a wild animal to use it. In the times before modern chemical manufacturing techniques, however, soap was made by boiling animal fats and wood ash together in a pot, which means that all of the chemicals in soap are gained from biological substances. So, in the context of this being a fantasy world, I would consider it reasonably possible that Mizutsune could evolve to produce soap. The next question is, how does Mizutsune make its bubbles? Well, the monster scales are meant to produce and hang on to the bubble foam. However, Mizutsune also has this purple fur along its belly. This fur is supposed to be really soft when wet, like a brush. In the game, Mizutsune creates its bubbles in two ways, either by exhaling them or by waving its tail around to stir up the foam. If you think about your average bubble wand, it's like a ring on the end of a stick. After dipping it, you get a thin film stretched over the hole and blow, and then bubbles come out. The wand serves to stretch the soap mixture out, and when you blow, you stretch the film further until it pinches off. This is also how Mizutsune would exhale bubbles. It would form a film over its mouth, probably in its throat, and blow. However, the structure of the bubble wand must have a complete loop. Otherwise, the surface tension will be too strong and the film will collapse. And that's our main problem, because Mizutsune primarily makes its bubbles using its tail, which is very similar to a brush. The hairs stick straight out from the body, and it doesn't look like they loop back in any way that would be able to form a ring. However, that doesn't mean this wouldn't work, and there's only one way to find out if it would. Alright everybody, it is time for the physical experiment. So, as you can see here, I've got this tub. It is filled just barely with water and soap, so that it contains bubbles. I chose this because, as it mimics the kind of environment we're fighting Mizutsune in really closely, where there's not a ton of water, just like a layer on the ground, and we can still stand fine. And I have three things here. I have a spatula, a scrubbing brush, and a paintbrush. And so I'm going to test each of these. Now, the spatula is going to be our control. It's not the best control. I probably could have found a better one, but I just want to use it to show you what I've been talking about with the bubbles. So you'll see, if you look closely, you'll see that the spatula has the soapy material stretched over the three holes in the middle. So if I blow through it, you get some pretty big bubbles. So that's how it's supposed to work. Now, when I swing the spatula back and forth, you'll notice here that none of the spatula holes are actually getting covered. This is just from the spatula swinging on the flat end. We are getting some bubbles, and these bubbles are just from the way the water is splashing onto itself. It traps some air underneath it, and then the soap would form a bubble. Now, next we are going to test the scrub brush. So the scrub brush has some nice hard bristles, which I would think would be good for structure, but they probably won't be good for forming those loops that are needed. Because as you can see, because they're so stiff, they all point the exact same direction, so there's no chance of them to twist over and form a loop. Alright, scrub brush test, go. So it looks like with the scrub brush, I am getting some larger bubbles here, and that's interesting. I'm going to try the spatula again. So once again, I changed up my strategy with the spatula a little bit to better mimic what I was doing with the brush, and once again, we got some of these bigger bubbles. So what that means is that the scrubbing brush is still just creating bubbles by the way the water splashes. Now lastly, we have the paintbrush. As you can see, the paintbrush has these more flexible strands, can go back and forth easier. So it's possible that these strands will help form a loop, that bubbles can be blown through. But based off of what I've seen so far, I don't think that's likely. I think instead we're going to see more or less the same results as in the past two tests. I should have gotten a towel. I am splashing all over the place. It's a good thing my wife's not going to get home soon. So it looks like, once again, the Mizutsune's, our scrub brush, our paintbrush, which best represents Mizutsune's actual method, does not produce any more significant advantage over the spatula. So, to review, we got a lot of little bubbles, but not a lot of big ones. When we did get big ones, it was because the water splashed so much, and the different types of brush didn't make a major difference over a flat surface. From this, I would conclude that the motion of the monster's tail, not the bristles, is what would create the bubbles. However, I only got big bubbles as the water splashed up against the sides of the tray, back onto itself. Without a similar amount of splashing, Mizutsune would barely be able to make any bubbles. Additionally, I tried flicking the bubbles to get them into the air, but they don't have enough structural integrity to fly off. Putting all this together, yes, Mizutsune could reasonably produce the right chemicals to make bubbles. However, the swirling of its tail would not be able to create large bubbles like we see in the game, which is a shame. I was originally going to end the video here, but as soon as I realized Mizutsune probably couldn't make any big bubbles, I could not stop theorizing about what kind of animal could, and I ended up creating this, Mizutsune 2.0. The changes I made are actually really simple. I just cut holes in Mizutsune's head fins to provide a surface that could act as a bubble ring, and then copy and pasted those fins all over its tail as well. By having these rings, Mizutsune can stretch its bubble foam out so it can better catch air. I did keep the bristles for easier sliding, however. In order for this new design to work, Mizutsune would probably have to make some changes to its battle strategy. In order to create a bubble, you have to pass air through the ring. Normally, this is done by either blowing the wand or waving it around in the air. I can't quite see a monster turning around and blowing onto its own tail, so Mizutsune 2.0 would generate bubbles by rapid movement, which works well because Mizutsune is already a very mobile monster. The fins on its tail are muscular. They can be either laid against the bristles or extended outward. When Mizutsune wants to create bubbles, it would extend the tail fins in order to catch the wind as it moves around. For instance, if it tilted its tail and lifted up the fins on one side, it could create a wave of bubbles in the direction the tail moved. It could also create shockwaves of bubbles by slamming its tail directly into the ground. And those are just a few examples. Additionally, my version of Mizutsune also has bubble wands on its head. Obviously, these can't be used in the same way as the tail, but the way they spread out would be great for catching the wind as Mizutsune does one of its slip and slide dashes. This would allow it to leave bubble trails as it moves. My favorite part of this idea could be Mizutsune creating a bubble trail as it runs away from the player, making pursuit more difficult, which would be a reasonable way such a creature would use an ability like this in real life. Overall, I'm imagining this version of Mizutsune would produce a lot more bubbles than the base form, basically making a little strange little maze of bubbles that you have to navigate through. To balance this out, I would make it so that bubbles wouldn't deal as much damage, but not by a ton, and additionally, Mizutsune would have to take regular breaks from the fight because in order to recharge its bubbles soap stuff, because as you know, bubble wands don't last forever. Eventually you need to dip them back into the bubble mix to get it a new film. So similarly, Mizutsune would semi-regularly have to pause in the middle of the battle and just kind of roll around in place in order to get a fresh cut of bubble foam over its fins. So this moment could be a chance if you are skilled or lucky enough in making it through the bubbles that to get a lot of extra damage in. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. If you liked it, go ahead and check out some of my other stuff. I've got a couple video essays and some meme videos. Thanks for watching, and make it a great week.